ingredients. There are optional ingredients. Maybe you have a little bit of sugar. And pie dough, American style pie dough is a neutral dough. It's not sweet, but sometimes you'll see a little bit of sugar in your recipe. Maybe there might be eggs. There's a recipe out there that has some egg. It also has some vinegar as part of your water. What would be the role of vinegar? What? Tenderizer. And you might have possibly some milk. I rarely see milk in a pie dough recipe. Okay, so there's your basic ingredients. Flour, pie dough. What do you think? Are we looking for a lot of gluten development or not so much? Not so much. You want to serve that piece of pie with a fork, not a knife and fork. You want to be able to cut it and eat it and have it be nice and tender in your mouth. So flour, we're looking for a lower gluten flour. So oftentimes in a professional recipe, you might have pastry flour. The formula in our book uses pastry flour, but I find that actually it doesn't give us enough structure. So I've altered the formula in your book to go 50% pastry flour, 50% all-purpose flour. Most home bakers don't have access to pastry flour. You make pie dough at home with all-purpose flour. You can get a great pie dough with all-purpose flour. You gotta be real careful you don't overwork it though. So we're gonna go part pastry, part all-purpose for ours, but we're trying to achieve a low gluten product here, a tender product. Fat, traditional American style pie dough uses shortening as the fat. Old-time bakers might use lard. We're going to use part butter, part shortening. We're using the butter for some flavor, and it's going to be a 50-50 mix, but traditionally it would be shortening.
Sorry, you said we're using 50-50.
Shortening and butter. Yeah. And your fat should be cold, make it easier to work with. Water. Water is variable. And the water should be what temp? Anybody know? Ice cold. Why would you use ice cold water, not warm water or hot water? You got to keep your fat cold. You want to keep your butter cold and solid. Second reason. Gluten. What about gluten? Yeah. So, ice cold. Keep your fat cold and solid. Use hot water to melt the fat. Second reason. The colder the water, the less gluten development you get. You have a much more manageable dough if you make it with cold water. Salt. Salt's a flavor enhancer. That's all it's there for. And you'll notice, remember the bread that we made that had no salt in it? You kind of get the same thing with pie dough. It has no salt. The description said it tastes flat. Doesn't mean that it's flat in texture. Just, it doesn't have any life to it. So salt's a flavor enhancer. The formula in your book has you dissolve the salt. It says dissolve the salt in the cold water, and then you add that to the pie dough. So I've told you that the water amount is variable, and I've told you that it's ice cold. So what is wrong with that technique of putting the salt in with the ice water?
It won't dissolve.
It won't dissolve. Salt won't dissolve in cold water. Okay? So what's the second thing that's wrong with that picture?
Might not put the full amount of salt.
Yes. If you don't use the full amount of water, you're not using all the salt, because the salt doesn't dissolve. It settles to the bottom of the container. So the other change that I've made in the formula from your book is that the salt goes in with the flour. So you might want to, sometime when you're reading your book, make those changes actually in your book. So if you ever go back to that formula, you're going to do those changes. Okay, sugar's optional. You got to be careful of too much sugar. Sugar is a browning ingredient. We bake our pie dough hot, which is 400 and above. So you get too much sugar in there, you're going to have too much browning too quickly. And then the eggs act as partly liquid, and the yolks are going to be tenderizers. So mixing. Our method for mixing is the cut-in or the biscuit method. you're going to start with the dry, which is going to be the flour and the salt. If you have a little bit of sugar, the sugar goes in there too. And you don't really have to sift these together, you can just whisk them together. And then we're going to cut in the fat. Today, with the crostata, I'm going to have you use the food processor to cut in your fat, just for the practice of it. And the pie dough that we'll make after the crostata is done, I'm going to have you cut that in by hand. So it's going to hopefully seem kind of familiar, like making scones. That's what it's going to be like. What we're going to do with our traditional American-style pie dough, when we cut in the fat, is we're going to cut it in two portions. And we're going to cut the first portion in, and this is for our lab today. So we're going to cut in our first portion of fat to about pea size. And then we're going to cut in our second portion of fat until that is about pea size. And while you're continuing to cut and you're getting this second portion down to pea size, this first portion of fat will be cut finer. So this will eventually end up more like a breadcrumb size, some of these pieces. So what that will do for us is give us a flaky dough and a tender dough. So the way you get flake, big pieces of fat, you have layers of dough, chunks of fat, there's dough, here's big chunks of fat, pea-sized pieces of fat, hazelnut-sized pieces of fat, there's your layers of dough. You go into the oven, hot oven. The protein structure of your dough sets up quickly. These big hunks of fat melt. They leave hollow spots, and what the hollow spots are in between these layers of dough is flakiness. So you get that with big pieces of fat. You don't get that with fine fat. You get a tender product with the fine fat, you get the flakiness with the pea size. So we're going for both. So you'll see some formulas that will tell you to cut all your fat in until it's pea size. You can get a very flaky dough. It won't be quite as tender. You might have a recipe that tells you to cut the fat in finer. Your stages are going to be, usually the description is pea size, might be hazelnut. And you get lots of flake here. Cut in finer, the description is often that the mixture resembles breadcrumbs. Now they're talking about the big breadcrumbs like panko, not real small breadcrumbs. But a description might be breadcrumbs. And you keep cutting in finer, and the description is that your mixture resembles cornmeal. That's cutting that fat in really fine, and you have a very tender product. Okay, so those are your descriptions for cutting in the fat. I want you to know those, and I want you to know about what size your fat is. So there's your fat, there's your fat, there's your fat. Not to scale. Then your next step after cutting in the fat is adding the water. So the crostata today, I want you to cut in the fat on the food processor. I don't want you to add the water on the food processor. You can go from tender to tough in a food processor in the blink of an eye. So this is just for cutting in the fat. Okay. So we're going to add the water. The water needs to be cold. The water's added gradually, and it is going to be variable. Cold, gradual. When you add the water, if you remember when we did the scones, when you add the water to your cutting mixture, you're going to kind of a stir, fold, toss technique with a long handle plastic scraper. And the dough that is getting wet, that is forming after the water hits the flour fat mixture, is going to try to clump up, and it'll want to seek other clumps of dough. And you'll find that your dough kind of naturally settles out into the dry pieces and the wet pieces. So kind of shake your bowl, and you'll find that the dry settles out, and then that's where you add more of your water rather than keep dumping it on the wet. And just keep tossing and moving, and then switch to your hand toward the end so you can actually feel the wetness of your dough, because there will be some water that's not quite worked in, and you can use your hand. Resist the temptation to knead you're just using your hand to kind of fold, toss, gently mix. So you don't want to be really working that dough and developing gluten. And you're going to stop when you get all of your dough to the right consistency, the right wetness. So this formula, if you cut in the fat properly according to the lab, this formula will generally take all of the water. If you're adding your water too slowly and you're working it too much, it won't take all of the water. And what you'll do is throw off your butter to flour to water ratio. You won't have enough water in your dough, and you won't actually be developing enough gluten to get enough structure. You'll have too much fat. When you bake your dough, it's going to be really greasy because it's got too much fat in there compared to everything else. So when you get to that point when you're tossing it, give me a shout. I want to see what's going on with it. If you end up with half your water left in the cup and you have something that feels like a dough, we're in trouble. Okay, you're going to have a really poor quality dough on your hands. So it's going to be tossing, adding, tossing, and then you're going to kind of collect it with your hands. And the reason that water is variable is the larger the hunks of butter you have, the more flour that has not been mixed with the butter, the more uncoated flour is in there. That flour is going to absorb more water. If you cut in the fat finer, it's coating the flour with fat. Fat's a moisture barrier. So let's say you go from pea size to cornmeal size, all of your flour is coated with some fat. You start adding your water, that flour cannot absorb all that water. So you want to really pay attention to mixing in your water and to how you cut in your fat. So if you had a formula for a tender pie crust, we call it mealy. If you had a recipe for a tender or mealy pie crust, it would actually have less water in that formula than a flaky pie crust recipe. So today the amount of water that we have should be just about perfect. Okay, so you're going to add your water, and then today what we're going to do is form 3 hamburger patties, 12 ounce, with our dough. And you're going to have a little nugget of dough left over. Each group will have about maybe 2 ounces of dough left over. We're going to collect all that, and we can usually form a whole other hamburger patty with it. And then we're going to wrap these, and we're going to chill them. We're going to put them in the fridge until Wednesday. Okay? So sometimes you'll see a formula like Enjoy Cooking or Betty Crocker, one of those books that tells you to take your pie dough and form it into a ball and wrap it and chill it and then bring it out and roll it. It's really difficult to take a ball of cold dough and roll it. So I want you to get a hamburger patty out of it. So we're going to go hamburger patty. After you make pie dough, then your next step after you add the water and you form your dough is you always chill it. Preferably a minimum of an hour. But if you have to rush it, then make your patty a lot thinner than the 1 inch, half inch, 1 inch. Make it thinner so that it chills all the way through. But the chilling process does several things. Chilling, resting. So what do you think that might do for your dough? So you've worked your fat, and as you're working it, you're softening it. You want to get that fat cold for your dough to be more manageable, and so that you maintain the hump so you get flakiness. So you're going to firm up the fat. What else does chilling do? Resting. Relaxes the gluten. And you're also allowing that flour to absorb moisture. And all this is going to give you a more manageable dough. It's easier to work with. So pie dough, you can store a couple days in the fridge. If you store it too long, it starts to get little black speckles on it, and it's going to start to spoil. So it freezes really well. If you're going to store it longer, you would want to freeze it. And then you take the dough out and you roll it. And when we get into lab with our crostata dough, I want to give you a rolling demo so that you start with a circle, you end with a circle. Okay, rather than something that looks like Texas or Oklahoma. Okay, so pull out your lab 1 crostata. And we'll go over what we're doing here. Okay, so the crostata, the cornmeal crust. So why do you think possibly we have all-purpose flour rather than pastry flour in this formula? Take a look at your ingredients. Because of the cornmeal. What is it about the cornmeal, Amber? Pardon me?
Is it like buffer to work with?
No.
Or doesn't have a lot of.
Yes. You guys have a lot of knowledge back in your brain, hidden in those little crevices of your brain. So you want to hold up. Okay, so you're not getting gluten development from the cornmeal. So we're going to rely just on the flour to give us our gluten development. And if your flour here is a lower protein flour, you're not going to get really good structure with this. I don't want you to think that you don't want to develop any gluten in your pie dough. You've got to get some gluten development or you're not going to have any structure there. So because of the cornmeal, which provides no gluten development, we're going to use all-purpose flour. So you're going to take the sugar, the all-purpose flour, the cornmeal, and the salt, and you're going to combine them. So just kind of whisk them together. And then you're going to cut up the butter. The butter is cold, so I'm leaving it in the fridge for now. You're going to take out your butter, chunk it up into like 1 inch, ½ inch cubes, something like that. Then you're going to throw the butter in the bowl with your dry, just like a regular mixing bowl over there. Toss it with your hands, and you're not working the butter like Grandma taught you to make pie dough. You're just tossing the butter with the dry so that the butter is coated with dry so it won't try to stick together. If you just have, hunks of butter that aren't coated with flour, then they kind of attract each other and then you get a blob of butter. Okay? And then that goes in the bowl of your food processor. Unfortunately, we only turned up 2 food processors, so we'll set them up on a couple tables. This next step is quick. It's like seconds, not minutes. So when you're done with the food processor, just leave it and another group can use it. You don't have to wash it. So now in the bowl of your food processor, you have the dry and you have the hunks of butter. You're going to use the food processor and the steel blade, and you're going to do a pulsing motion, which is just to turn it on, a couple seconds, stop it. These processors don't have pulse like the Cuisinarts do, so it's on-off. So your thumbs are the pulser. Okay, so turn it on, turn it off. And it's just really zip, zip, maybe it's 3 zips. So after each zip, you want to take a look and see how well your fat is being cut up. Okay, you want to keep the fat chunky, pea size, so this won't take long. Okay, you can't stand there and turn on and start talking, gazing around the room, spacing out. So then you're going to take that mixture, you're going to dump it back into the original bowl, so you're not washing 3 bowls when you only need to wash 1, and then go back to your table. Leave the processor for someone else to use. Don't wash it. There's no reason to wash it in between uses. And then you're going to have the water by hand, not on the machine. So you're going to want a long-handled rubber scraper. You want your ice water, and I think what we'll do is just get a big pitcher of ice water, and you guys can measure off from that. So measure off about 4 tablespoons to take to your table so you're not running back for more. You're going to drizzle in about a tablespoon at a time. I'm telling you 3. Okay, so take the 3 tablespoons. Drizzle that over the top, sprinkle it over the top, and then mix together. And then see if the dough will hold together. You want to press it together. If it does not hold together, it's too dry. And let me see it at that point. And then if you need to add more water, you want to add it just a small increment at a time, like a teaspoon now, not a tablespoon, because you can easily go from perfect to over wet until we get dough that's going to hold together. Then you're going to form it in a big patty. We're going to wrap it up, throw it in the fridge. We want to give it 45 minutes. Ideally, you give it longer. And here's the deal with cornmeal. Cornmeal will absorb moisture. but you want to give it some time. So 45 minutes is like barely enough, but we want to get out of here on time. If you were going to be making this at home or planning ahead, give it a couple of hours, and the dough is much more manageable than it will be today. Then we'll take the dough out, we'll roll it out, and you're going to roll your dough into a circle. It does not have to be perfect. A crostata is rustic. That's one of the beauties of it. It's rustic, and so if it doesn't look perfect, it doesn't matter. It's not like fine European pastries. Okay, so you're going to get it into a circle as best you can. You're shooting for a 12-inch circle. So what's the size of a half-sheet pan? 12 by 16. So you can use this as your guide. You don't want to get it much bigger than your half-sheet pan, because then it's not going to fit well. So you're going to roll out your dough. If we have trouble rolling the dough today, because it's so fresh, you can either roll it between parchment or you can roll it between 2 pieces of plastic wrap if it starts to stick a lot. So you don't want to give it a lot of flour because it's sticking, because it's just that it's, it hasn't rested. So you're going to roll your dough out to about a 12-inch circle. You're going to transfer it to a piece of parchment paper and then put it on your pan so that we don't have to move it again. And then we're going to put the filling on. So there's your crostata dough all rolled out nicely. Your filling is going to be an apple filling, and the apples are, you see them? Oh, right in front of me. Okay. So you want about a pound of apples per group. And be flexible on this. It's just a crostata. After you peel these down and slice them, if you end up with like 14 1/4 ounces instead of 14, it is no big deal. Okay, it's just a crostata. It's not like baking soda or yeast or something. Okay, so be a little flexible. If you have 12 ounces, that's cool. So you want to peel these, core these, and then slice them. These need to be thinly sliced. If you have big hunks of apple, they will not bake in the time that it takes your dough to bake. This is only about a 30-minute bake in the oven. So you want to have fairly thin slices of apple. This is a Golden Delicious apple. It is a nice baking apple. It will hold its shape pretty much when you bake, rather than turning it into applesauce like some apples will. So this is Golden Delicious. So you're going to slice your apples, and then we need a little bit of thickener, and we need some sweetening powder, and we need some spice in there. So after you slice your apples, you're going to combine your dry ingredients. The dry is going to be a little bit of sugar, some spice of your choice, and the flour. You're going to mix those dry together, and then you're going to toss your apples with that. This step, you're going to hold off tossing the dry with the apples until you're ready to load your dough with your apple filling. So why are you waiting to toss the apples with that mixture? Any guesses? Yeah, the sugar is going to pull the liquid out of the apples. And then you'll end up, so let's say you do your apples now, and then you make your dough and you chill it and yada, yada, yada. An hour later, you're ready for your apples. You go look in that bowl of apples, and what do you have? You have a lot of moisture down at the bottom. And that's just going to drip out of your crostata. So you can prepare your dry, you can prepare your apples. Please don't put your apples in water with lemon juice. What you're doing, the apples are going to absorb water, they're going to kick it back out when you bake them. You're going to have some spice like cinnamon and nutmeg, that's brown. If your apples turn a little brown, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So you peel, slice your apples, cover them with plastic right on the surface. Get your dry prepared. Leave those separate. After you've rolled out the pastry, then toss those two together. You're going to pile the apples in the center. Leave about 2 inches or so around, so there's your apples. And then we're going to egg wash. The purpose of that is glue. And then you're going to fold and pleat. It's top over, and after it's folded and pleated, it looks like that. So the center is exposed. Crostatas are open face. And then you're going to egg wash the rim for prettiness. And then we're going to throw a little bit of butter, some little thin slices of butter on top to keep those apples moist. And then we're going to top it with streusel. There's probably streusel left, so before you make the streusel, I'll go look for you. I try to keep a bag of streusel around. You never know when you need streusel. So before you start making it, check with me. Okay? Then we're going to go into the deck. We've had trouble with the deck having an awful lot of bottom heat. So probably need to adjust that bottom heat down to probably nothing. We can go in the convection if we need to. But formulas that you're given, Bake at 400 degrees, approximately 25 to 30 minutes. It's understood that this is a regular conventional, not convection oven, this temperature. So if you're gonna go in the convection oven, what is your adjustment? 50 degrees, lower. So if we went to the convection oven, what temp are we gonna use? 350. And we always use the low fan unless it's something that I think that we just need to blast really fast. There's a high and a low setting on it, low fan on that. So if we find that we want to bake in there, we can do that also. And your baking time is usually less in the convection oven than what's given. Okay, so test for doneness. You want your fruit done, you want your pastry done. So you've got a couple of different tests for doneness. You're going to test the fruit with a fork. You're serving this with a fork, not a paring knife. Okay? So a paring knife will go through something easier than the fork will. So you want to be fork tender. So you're going to reach in, you're going to poke the fruit with a fork and see if it's fork tender. You need to see the filling bubble. That's boiling in there. So what do you know about starch as a thickening agent? Yes, it thickens at its greatest potential when it comes to a boil. So you want to have your filling, you want to see some bubbling going on. And then the pastry. That pastry needs to be done also. If you bake on parchment, sometimes you can just lift up the parchment and check the bottom, see if the bottom's done. I want you to touch the crust. It should feel firm. You're not going on color for doneness so much, you're going on feel. And where you've pleated and overlapped, you want to kind of look in there and see if it's doughy or if it looks like it's done. But you definitely do want to get a nice golden brown color going on. Good customer appeal. And on the bottom, if you're not golden on the bottom, then you can guarantee that you're going to have a soggy bottom crust. So you want to check your bottom also. Then we're going to bring those out, let them cool down. We're going to cut them up, we're going to eat them. And take them home. So after you've made your pie dough, your crostata dough, and you've prepped your apples, you'll have time to make your pie dough. I think, unless you're really slow. You'll have time to make your pie dough. So then I want you to make this formula here. And this one is going to be made by hand for the practice of it using a pastry blender. This is a pastry blender. So we've got shortening in this formula. The shortening is in the fridge. I want to keep it cold. And then we also have butter, so keep your butter cold also. And you're going to begin the cutting in process with the butter first, because the butter is going to be harder to cut in. The shortening cuts in really easily, so you start with the butter, you get the butter to pea size, and then you throw in the shortening, you get the shortening to pea size, and then some of your butter is still pea size, some of it is going to be a little finer. And then you're going to add the water, and it's going to be, a little bit at a time, but not too little. You're going to be tossing. It's going to be the same technique as your crostata dough when it comes to adding the water. So you should see hunks of fat in your dough when you're done. And then you'll scale into 12-ounce portions. You make a hamburger patty. You wrap it in plastic wrap. We'll label it. We'll put it in the fridge. And then this will be used next time we meet. And then your pastry for the crostata should be ready to roll out at that point. Questions? Does anybody have an apple corer on them? Sometimes you guys have them in your knife kit. Anybody else? Okay, we have an apple corer that we can use. Otherwise, what you can do is peel your apples, cut them in half, and then use, if you have a melon baller, that works, or a heavy-duty stain. So this one's kind of, I don't know if this will work, this is kind of thin. But if you have a teaspoon, stainless steel teaspoon measure that you know is a heavy-duty one, you can scoop out the core with that. So you should all have teaspoon tips. The apple core, if you're doing any work with pears and apples, apple core, is that John Cook's one that he sells? You got the tube kind, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I got
great.
it from Apple Hill.
They're great. Oh, Apple Hill. Oh, Apple Hill's coming up. We should all go to Apple Hill. Okay, questions on what we're doing? Okay, pastry flour is normally down on